How's it going, everybody? I hope you're all doing well. Okay, so I don't think it's a surprise to anybody that hypocrisy, the practice of claiming to have beliefs or moral standards to which one's own behavior does not conform, is one of the oldest moral failings in human society. And it's a behavior universally disparaged, yet at the same time, it's ubiquitous, especially in religious, political, and social life. And I can't think of a better and more famous reference of hypocrisy than in the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus says this. He says, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye?" Here he's pointing out a person who's obsessing over another person's minor flaw while remaining blind to their own far more serious faults. So here, hypocrisy is something like the failure of self-awareness. And then there's what he says about the Pharisees, which were the religious elite of his time. He calls them whitewashed tombs, which of course means something like he sees them as beautiful and clean on the outside, but full of corrosion and rot on the inside. In other words, they preach virtue and they display piety, but in reality what they practice is vanity. They burden others with principles they themselves don't uphold. So I think what we can get from this is that what makes hypocrisy so dangerous, according to Jesus, among many other things, is not just that it involves self-deception and lack of honesty, but that it also masquerades as holiness. It's self-righteousness cloaked in outward purity. It uses the language of righteousness to cover up things like self-interest and pride and power. In this way, it becomes a kind of theater and a kind of manipulation. And speaking of theater and acting, you know who else is relevant here when it comes to the topic of hypocrisy? Well, the French-Swiss philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So he saw hypocrisy not merely as a kind of personal failing, but as a problem of culture. In other words, a problem that was constitutive of modern civilization itself. So basically, in his view, hypocrisy arises when what we seem to be on the outside deviates sharply from what we really are. And for Rousseau, this split between appearance and reality, isn't natural. No, like I said, it's a product of the development of society. Okay, but that's maybe way too quick, so let me go into some detail here. So what Rousseau does is he distinguishes between natural man and civilized man. Now, natural man, and by that he means human beings in their natural state before the onset of civilization. Natural man is honest, and he's direct, and he's simple, and he's pretty much guided by compassion. Civilized man, on the other hand, well, he's different. Because he has to now survive in a competitive economic environment, he is not honest. No, he's duplicitous. That's to say, he does good things or he acts morally in order to gain social approval. In this way, he learns to value reputation over truth. He doesn't live to actually be good, but to be seen as good. It's all about appearances. Or to put all this somewhat differently, basically Rousseau thought that what civilization did is it thwarted our best and natural impulses and instead made people somewhat fake and insincere. That's to say, civilization produced people obsessed with how they're perceived by others. And so the result was, well, things like the seeking of status and vanity and pettiness and decorum, and not to mention certain accompanying black emotions like jealousy and greed and vengefulness. Now, all of this is what hypocrisy was for Rousseau. It was a kind of fakeness or inauthenticity. a public performance, a mask wearing, an obsession with appearances, a wholeness that society obsessed with money and gain has stripped away. And actually, I said mask wearing just now, and that's entirely relevant when we look at the etymology of the word hypocrisy. You see, the word hypocrisy comes from the ancient Greek hypokrisis, and it meant acting on stage or playing a part. In ancient Greek theater, actors wore masks to play different roles. And the term eventually came to describe somebody who pretends to be something that they're not. Anyway, so how relevant is this kind of hypocrisy today? I mean, in our world of social media and profile building and branding, Rousseau's insights about hypocrisy feel more relevant than ever. After all, we live in a time when people basically curate their entire lives for public consumption, and where performative gestures and virtue signaling often substitute for real ethical action, and where institutions continue to evangelize values that they often betray. Now, this is all a very dangerous kind of hypocrisy. It's dangerous because it's an hypocrisy that disconnects us from our own nature, from truth, and from others around us. Actually, this reminds me that Rousseau himself was so personally concerned with succumbing to hypocrisy that one day he made the decision to no longer lie to himself and to others. He talks about this in a book he wrote, appropriately called The Confessions. In that all-revealing book, Rousseau takes up the project of a kind of radical sincerity, even if it means admitting all sorts of shameful things, which he actually does. Boy, does he. Just check that out if you're interested. But anyway, his position is that real honesty about the self, especially about one's own inadequacies and one's own failings, is not only morally better than hypocrisy, but it's also more human. What Rousseau wants to try to be is in alignment with himself. And he also wants a society where people can be real, not just reputable. So, despite their differences, both Jesus and Rousseau agree on something very essential, and that is that hypocrisy is a threat to truth and to authenticity. It deceives others. Yes, that's obvious. But worse maybe, it deceives the self. What I mean is that hypocrites often become so deeply set in their grandstanding and in their performance that they lose connection with who they really are. And one could argue that hypocrisy like this is often more insidious than outright wrongdoing. I mean, a shoplifter knows they're stealing, but a hypocrite, well, he acknowledges no such thing. No, he convinces himself that he's righteous. So here, hypocrisy doesn't just hide wrongdoing. Rather, it swaps genuineness with self-deception. And so, it makes people hollow, like shiny, empty tombs, like masks without faces behind them. The bottom line is that for both Jesus and Rousseau, we have to try to do what we can to drop the facade and return to living with integrity, which means that we have to stop performing virtue if we really want to practice it. We have to be true to others and true to ourselves. Bye for now.